Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the Threats and Trends Weekly Update. This is the first time we'll be doing this live, and we might be doing this more live here in the future. So let me know down in the comments what you think. Let me know where you're watching from. It'd be definitely interesting to see where everybody is and what you think. So there's a lot to talk about. So we're just going to go ahead and dive right in. And basically, how this format is going to run is I'm going to show the slides. I'm going to hide my face while we're going through the actual update. At the end of every single section, there's like some time that we're going to have for everybody to put their comments and their thoughts on what you're thinking, and we'll kind of have a conversation about what we've previously discussed in the last section, and then we're going to kind of bounce into the next section. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Actually, I'm going to need to keep my face on. I forgot because I have my mic. So what we're going to be covering today, we're basically going to be covering the typical Ukraine weekly update that we've been doing. If you've been watching my channel for some time now, then you're probably familiar with what this basically the structure is going to be. We're going to go through the strategic overview of what's been going on in Ukraine. We're also going to hit on the operational layer of what's going on in Ukraine, just to kind of understand, what are the current, military operations that are ongoing. Really, right now, it's just, a Russian offensive, but there's also some concern on the Russian side and some optimism on the Ukrainian side of a Ukrainian offensive. And then, we're going to dive into the tactical picture. Then we're going to, kind of have some time to kind of converse on what we've discussed there. Then we're going to dive into the Armenia-Azerbaijan tensions. There's been some kind of interesting developments there, so definitely something to track. Then we're going to get to talking about Iran. So let's get started with the Ukraine weekly update with the strategic picture. So, of course, and actually, I want to go back here to give an honorable mention. This is, of course, kind of related to what's going on in Ukraine, but Finland joining NATO. You might have seen the news today that Turkey's parliament has ratified and basically allowed Finland to go ahead and join into NATO. There's some political disagreements there, to sum it up, really between Turkey and Hungary, and then with kind of the statements and the political positioning of Finland and Sweden. Currently, Sweden still has not been allowed to join. I'm tracking both Turkey and Hungary. I'm not sure if either one of them has changed their position, but both Hungary and Turkey this week altered their position, allowed Finland into NATO, which is a pretty big and important piece. So I wanted to give that a little shout here at the very beginning to cover that. But first, let's talk about Putin's announcement that they will be sending nuclear weapons to Belarus. This is kind of an interesting point. I really do kind of personally believe that this is more bluster and just rhetoric for the West, not necessarily something that would signal any kind of policy change or willingness to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. However, it's still something to note because it's another location that nuclear weapons are located. And one of the critical components here on these nuclear weapons is who's controlling them. So that, you can put them on a country, but, who actually has operational day-to-day control over these weapons? Is it going to be Russia? They have a large contingent of forces there in Belarus, or is it going to be Belarus? And originally I saw that, Putin was kind of stating that Russia would maintain operational control over these weapon systems. But today, Lukashenko actually announced that Belarus would have operational control. So I think that's going to be an area of concern, is kind of identifying who's controlling these nuclear weapons. But in either case, I think it's really just more bluster, more of something to try to deter Western support for Ukraine, and not an actual indicator that Russia is going to use nuclear weapons. And kind of to back this up, Financial Times released a report that during Xi Jinping's meeting to Moscow, Xi Jinping basically told Vladimir Putin to not use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So there's definitely a lot of incentives for Russia to not use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And I think that this announcement is really just more bluster aimed at the West. Next, we're talking about Prigozhin and the continued kind of infighting in the disputes in the information space with Russia. I feel like, this week it kind of looks like it slowed down a little bit on the frequency of criticism from Prigozhin to the Ministry of Defense. Prigozhin posted a lengthy video where he claimed to have unveiled and discovered Ukrainian plans for a counteroffensive. And if you've seen that video, it's kind of interesting. You really have to take everything Prigozhin says with a grain of salt. A lot of what he says really is in the interest of Prigozhin and Prigozhin only. But he's definitely kind of kept up the heat, and there's definitely been some concerns on what his actual interests are within Russia. But one of the things that he criticized this week was the arrest of a father in the province of Tula, who was arrested for basically his daughter had drawn an anti-war drawing, and the father was arrested for it. And so Prigozhin kind of criticized this, but I mean, as far as criticisms of policy and the military policy, he seems to have slowed down, at least this week, in his rhetoric. Next, of course, we've got the visit from the Iranian foreign minister to Moscow, where he met with Sergei Lavrov. Really, the focus here was to further develop the bilateral ties between Iran and Russia. If you've paid a lot of attention to this situation, it's kind of interesting because, again, as the war has drawn on, you're seeing the evolution of Russia's stature with its allies and its alliance partners kind of evolving. So like, for instance, whereas before the war, Russia and China would have interacted as peers. Now, with Xi Jinping's last visit to Moscow, you kind of see a bit of a dynamic where Russia is no longer on a peer status with China. And now with Iran, they went from being, kind of Iran not necessarily being a peer to now them being peers. So, this is kind of a meeting between the Iranian and the Russian foreign ministers, basically to further develop their bilateral relationship. You might know that Iran has been sending a lot of Shahed kamikaze drones to Russia, which they've been diligently employing on the battlefield. And there's been some concern about the sale of Iranian ballistic missiles, but I haven't seen anything that has indicated that that is imminent. So there's definitely some trade there. One of the other line items that's being considered for trade right now is the Su-35 to Iran. And this is probably just going to continue, where there's going to be exchanges of weapons systems and capabilities between the two to really enable both partners in their particular conflict zones. And we're going to talk, of course, about Iran and their regional concerns here at the end of this live stream. Of course, I noticed another item here that Wagner may be receiving Shahed drones. So, of course, if you've kept close track of the battlefield and kind of the way that the Russian military has kind of run their fighting, you have the Russian conventional army acting in some areas kind of on their own, but then in areas like Bakhmut, they act in concert with Wagner, where Wagner will do a lot of the heavier fighting, but the conventional military is still very much present, still very much involved in the fighting. So the Institute for the Study of War published that they believe that Wagner may be receiving Shahed drones and that they may be training on the Shaheds as well, which is definitely interesting. That's a new capability for Wagner to receive, and that's definitely that enables them deeper strike capabilities. So far, what it appears like is that Russia has really used the Shaheds to kind of amplify and complement its strategic bombing campaign, and really by that saying using them to target civilian infrastructure throughout Ukraine. So it'd be kind of interesting to see how Wagner would employ the Shaheds, whether they would actually use them against military targets or if they would also use them against static civilian infrastructure. But in either case, more parties having access to this weapon system for Ukraine may not necessarily be a good thing. Next, we want to talk about the Ukrainian offensive. So we don't want to talk too much about it, but and really time is just going to have to tell on what's true and what's false. I already talked about some of the open speculation that Prigozhin may have fabricated, or he may have he spoke about, but there's certainly a lot of optimism that Ukraine will be able to mount a counteroffensive here in the spring. The Ukrainian one of the heads of the Ukrainian military recently basically outlined April, May as a time frame for this offensive, and it really kind of depends on a number of things. But you kind of see some concern in the Russian information space, where they're openly talking about concern on Russia's ability to maintain offensive operations just because of running out of material and personnel, but also on the wisdom of continuing offensive operations, because they're concerned that if they do continue these offensive operations and they attrit themselves down to a point where they can no longer attack, well, there's also extended concern that they wouldn't even be able to defend if Ukraine mounted a significant level of pressure. So we're definitely kind of interesting to keep an eye on. I saw some videos on OSINT Twitter of a number of Ukrainian military vehicles kind of preparing for something, but that could have been recorded at any point and posted recently. So it's kind of, if you notice anything publicly like that, you really got to take it with a grain of salt. But it's, I note here that, Ukraine has received a number of key capabilities that can enable future operations. But, I think we need to kind of set some expectations here. They've received capabilities such as, Bradley IFVs, Marder IFVs, Leopard tanks, and Patriot defense systems, not all of which they may use tactically or operationally. Like Patriots, they may use for, more strategic level air defense. But, I think it's important for us to kind of understand that this, as soon as an offensive happens, it's probably not going to be like Kharkiv. And it might not even look like Kherson. If you remember, Kherson kind of lasted for several months before the Russian forces decided to retreat across the river. And a lot of that was really just because of the disadvantageous positioning that they had on the right bank, or if you look on the map here, the left side of the Dnieper River. So, right now, if you look at the map here, Russia occupies a lot of territory around, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk. And they've put a lot of combat power into that territory, and they've been spending months and months and months publicly preparing defensive positions. So I think it might be kind of challenging for Ukraine to dislodge those positions anytime soon. But there's always a chance. Like considering Bakhmut as an example, or even Kremenna or Avdiivka, where there's been a lot of fighting, or even Vuhledar. Vuhledar might be a good example, even though there's not been a lot of fighting around Vuhledar that I'm aware of lately, at least not in the same intensity of like Avdiivka, Kremenna, Bakhmut. But, unless kind of Russia attrits their own combat capability to a point where they're exhausted, and then Ukraine exploits, and it exploits in a significant enough way that they can overmatch and cause, a breach in defense, then we, shouldn't necessarily expect massive territorial changes, kind of like what we saw in Kharkiv. Next, for the operational layer. So we're currently, continuing to monitor the Russian offensive. It's continuing along Luhansk and Donetsk. I think we're continuing to kind of see that the Kremenna, Bakhmut, and Avdiivka have seen the majority of the fighting to this point. We've talked about in past weekly updates Vuhledar, where the Russian Ministry of Defense has kind of taken the lead on attacking, but you'll see in Kremenna, it's largely Ministry of Defense. It's, Bakhmut, it's kind of a mix. And then Avdiivka, and we'll talk about this more in the tactical, or the tactical layer, a potential Wagner deployment to Avdiivka, which is interesting. So that's kind of like the big picture. Now we're going to go ahead and dig into the tactical picture. It's important to note that here, the tactical layer, where it changes pretty frequently, that, it's important, it can be beneficial to monitor, but you can't really monitor too close because, again, it just evolves so quickly. You kind of have to zoom out to more of an operational or a strategic layer to kind of get an idea on what the future of this war is going to look like. So first, starting with the Kremenna-Svatova line, largely positional fighting that I've been able to, identify here. A lot of fighting going on still around Kremenna, and then some positional fighting around Svatova, as well as towards Kupiansk. But no serious changes from either side here. Some marginal Russian advances near Svatova, but to this point, it really looks like while the fighting is certainly intense, both sides have managed to kind of prevent the other from achieving a massive breakthrough in either direction. South towards Bakhmut, and this map is slightly outdated that I'm tracking today. Russia has made some advances within central Bakhmut that I'm tracking. Ukraine has still managed to maintain an open supply line to the west of Bakhmut, so they can keep their defensive forces in the town, replenish and potentially reinforce. But from what it looks like from my vantage point, and really we have to take that from a grain of salt because I'm not there, but it looks like the Ministry of Defense is probably, or the Russian Ministry of Defense has largely moved their uniformed military towards the outskirts to secure the flanks, and they're funneling Wagner to the inside. From what I've been able to read, it looks like largely Wagner troops operating inside of Bakhmut, capturing like the Azom industrial complex this week, while uniformed troops are outside the city. So certainly a continuing to evolve situation there in Bakhmut. Something to keep an eye on. This battle has been going on for a very long time. I've seen a lot of folks, kind of indicating that it would be better for Ukraine to move to the west of Bakhmut and not, invest too many troops and over-attrit themselves and therefore compromise their ability to counterattack in this area. But, I really think time is just going to have to tell to see what works and what doesn't. Of course, we've seen a slowdown in attacks in this area in the past few weeks, and we've noted that in past weekly updates. But it really looks like in the past 48 to 72 hours, fighting has really ramped up here. And then, of course, towards Avdiivka, Russia appears to have made some advances to the north of the city. And this is kind of a similar situation in some degree to Bakhmut, where Ukraine is really able to hold on to the town, and they're able to hold on to critical supply lines that enable it to defend the town. And they've kind of forced Russia to over-attrit themselves while trying to push for territory outside the city. So this fight has gone on for longer than Bakhmut. I mean, south of Avdiivka is Donetsk City, which, I mean, if you're familiar with the 2014 war, I mean, this has been a frontline position for a very, very long time. But there was a rumor of Wagner involvement in this fight, and Prigozhin actually denied that. But ISW again notes that Wagner fighters' obituary cited Avdiivka as a place of death. So that would be kind of interesting to see if that is the case. If Wagner fighters are down there, it might indicate that the Russian Ministry of Defense is kind of having a personnel problem in that area, and they're kind of looking for organisms or personnel to kind of borrow to help out with some of the tougher fighting. But that will be definitely something to continue to monitor into the future. So with all that, I want to get your thoughts. I see we have a few people in here, so go ahead and comment what you think so far of this. This kind of concludes the weekly update for Ukraine, but we still have we have a couple more sections that we need to talk about. So let me know what you think, and I'm going to grab some water. We give a few more minutes here before we get going in case anyone's typing. Doesn't look like it, so we might just jump right in, but give it a couple more minutes. Alrighty, no comments, so we'll go ahead and dive into the Armenia Azerbaijan update. This has been kind of an interesting thing to monitor, and we're going to talk about really more at a strategic level. I don't want to get into any of the tactical stuff. I don't think that that's necessarily of any value yet, but really something to kind of level set here, right? I have a video coming up in the next few weeks that's basically going through the annual IC threat assessment. And one of the things that they note here is Armenia and Azerbaijan as a future conflict. I've talked a little bit about this on Twitter. I think that this is kind of a consequence of the downgrading of Russian military combat power, because they were the ones that were acting as peacekeepers in this area. And so if no one's really able to step in as a third party and act as a peacekeeping force and enforce a ceasefire, then because this specific conflict in 2020 didn't really get resolved, it really just got put on pause, then it's really just kind of a ticking time bomb before tensions kind of resume. So here at a strategic level, again, kind of a review is in 2022, or sorry, 2020, these two countries fought a conflict in a province called Nagorno-Karabakh. It's highlighted here in yellow with the red arrow in it. It didn't really end, and it was a pretty brutal conflict. It kind of gave us, if you want to think of it this way, as like a preview for what the war in Ukraine would kind of look like. And by that I mean, you get these videos of like TB2 drones annihilating armored columns in open territory. And it's similar to what we saw with Russian tanks at the start of the war in Ukraine. This war did not really end. It really more was put on pause. And the reason I say that is, after some amount of time with the fighting, a ceasefire negotiation was agreed to, and Russia was both the mediator and the enforcing element of the third party here. And with Russia's basically lack of ability to enforce a ceasefire here in Nagorno-Karabakh, then there's really nothing stopping either side from kind of resuming the fighting, because no one's going to stop them. So it's kind of a concerning situation unless another third party were to step in and kind of be that blocking party. Then it's going to be a bit of a concerning area to monitor. But let's go ahead and jump into what happened in the past couple of weeks. There was an Azeri attack on an Armenian convoy, which happened to have some Russian peacekeepers in it. And I'm tracking that some Russian peacekeepers were in fact wounded during this attack. There was also an Azerbaijan incursion into Armenia along the Nagorno-Karabakh border. And that I'm aware, these forces are still in Armenia and they're fortifying to this day. So that's obviously not positive towards a ceasefire. Tensions are still high, but things luckily so far haven't escalated. So we can certainly hope that doesn't happen. But what doesn't help the situation is that an Azeri MP was targeted by unknown suspects. And I don't know if I have that in the next slide. No, I don't. Basically, an investigation by the Azerbaijani government seems to indicate that Iran was culpable, or at least some part involved in this attack, which we're going to talk a little bit about this in the Iranian section. Iran and Azerbaijan have tensions of their own along their own border, but Azerbaijan has kind of grown its international relationship, its bilateral relationships with Turkey and with Israel. You kind of saw during that 2022 war some development of military capabilities by Azerbaijan thanks to agreements with both Turkey, like for instance with the TB2, as well as Israel with some other weapon systems. And of course for Armenia, it's kind of they just need somebody to help them out. The unfortunately for them, were pretty overmatched in that conflict to some degree. So Iran and Azerbaijan, they've had some tensions. Not quite sure why Iran would want to just outright attempt to target an Azeri MP, but time is just going to have to tell on if that is truthful and why. But with that, a bit of a quicker update, just because there's a lot of unknowns here. I don't want to get too far into unknown territory. I'd rather just kind of stick to here's what we know and get your thoughts on that. So I will pause again, see if you have any thoughts. Okay, doesn't look like any thoughts here either. So we will go ahead and move on to the next section. Iran. And we haven't talked too much about Iran in this on this channel yet. We've really focused largely on the war in Ukraine. And if you're just joining, we've already talked about that section. It's at the very beginning of the live stream. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns on that update or anything not related to the update. But we're going to go ahead and jump into Iran here. At a strategic level, protests seem to continue, however, in smaller and smaller groups. From what I've been able to identify, and again, this kind of ties in again to that threat assessment video that's going to be coming out here in a couple of weeks. But Iran seems to be achieving some level of success in quelling these protests for now. However, they will probably start to have some issues with preventing more protests here in the future, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute. Iran's also providing some material support to Russia. We've already talked a little bit about that in the Ukraine-Russia section with the Iranian foreign minister's visit to Moscow. But that is continuing on, and they're also receiving some capabilities from Russia. But also, tensions with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh and other issues. We might talk about that a little bit as well, but we're also going to talk a little bit about Syria, because that's an important topic with this. So, of course, in Syria this past week, U.S. and Iranian proxies exchanged fire with each other. There was a Shahed drone that killed a U.S. contractor and injured a few others on a U.S. base in Syria. As a result, the U.S. struck on Iranian proxies and within Syria, and then there was a counterstrike from Iran back on U.S. bases, which appears to have only caused a series of injuries. Fortunately, that I'm tracking, none killed. But that has led to some tensions beyond just the pre-existing tensions in Syria between U.S. forces and Iranian proxies in this area. So we haven't seen any further developments in this since this happened. I'm wanting to hit that here. But if we notice anything going on, if we decide to do another live stream, or next time we cover Iran on this channel, I'll be sure to cover any updates here on that. On a strategic level, we've already talked about how protests are continuing but are shrinking in size. It appears that the root causes aren't necessarily addressed. If you look at the messaging from the Iranian government, a lot of these protests were cultural issues. We're talking about the hijab, we're talking about some other issues. And a lot of the messaging from the Iranian government doesn't really seem to indicate mobility of opinion or stance on these subjects. So these protests may not have necessarily led to change just yet, but they may revamp due to economic concerns, due to more political concerns. There's a lot of reasons to be concerned that protests will continue in Iran, but we'll just have to wait and see on that. Of course, we already talked about the assassination attempt on an Azeri MP in Azerbaijan. Tensions have continued in the border, and you get some, public messaging from the Iranian foreign ministry and from the Iranian military, kind of taking a jab at Azerbaijan and on the border, kind of referencing these tensions. There are some videos of Iranian forces kind of moving towards that border. Again, you have to take everything with a grain of salt. But there's definitely concern on not only Nagorno-Karabakh, but the Azeri border with Iran. So if a conflict were to happen in Nagorno-Karabakh, I think another key area to keep an eye on and monitor with Azerbaijan would be its border with Iran. And then, of course, you have tensions with Israel and the U.S. and Syria, which further complicate Iran's situation. They really have a lot going on. They have domestic troubles, they have economic problems, and then you have several key areas where foreign policy is really not in a great position that they probably want it to be at. So Iran's definitely kind of an interesting country to keep an eye on. They have a pretty challenging and interesting problem set. Then it will be kind of interesting to see what they do. So what do you think? This will be our last section here. So what do you think on Iran? What do you think on Armenia, Azerbaijan? What do you think on the Russia-Ukraine update? Let me know, and I want to hear your thoughts. Also, let me know your thoughts on this format for a weekly update. This is the first time we've gone live. This is the first time that we're kind of doing this weekly update. Typically, I like to do it in more of like a produced, edited manner, as you can probably tell, just because I feel like I can have kind of more control over the graphics and kind of, the user presentation is a bit sleeker. But if this is kind of a format you would like to see going further, let me know down in the comments, post it in the chat. It would be very useful for me to track that. So let me know your thoughts. Gonna give just 30 more seconds here or so, see if anybody has anything that they want to comment. Then I'll probably shut it down for the day. Thank you for watching, everybody that has watched. If you are just joining, we have already gone through all the updates. But if you have anything that you want to talk about that wasn't talked about today, and let me go ahead and scroll up. And this is what we talked about today. So if you want to kind of see what we already talked about, you can scroll through already in the stream and see what we've hit. But if you want to talk about anything that's not covered here or expound upon anything that's covered here, let me know down in the chat. We've already run through everything. So depending on if anybody says anything and what they say, we might call it. Alrighty, seeing no comments, so we will go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you everybody for watching. Let me know down in the video comments again, if you have time, what you think of this format. I'm not necessarily committed to doing live streams every week. Doing this kind of threat brief, again, like I've mentioned already, the format I typically run for is pre-produced, edited, scripted stuff, just because I feel like it's really, I kind of enjoyed a little bit more. But if you would like to see more live streams like this, kind of doing the threat brief, let me know, and we can kind of make that like a weekly thing. It probably, or I say weekly thing, make it a semi-regular thing. So I need to know down in the comments kind of what you think. Otherwise, there's not really much else I can kind of go off. Probably would default back to doing the scripted, edited weekly updates, kind of like what we've been doing. Or another thought, if you don't want weekly updates, let me know. I mean, I'm kind of looking for some feedback here, but anyway, that is our weekly update here. Thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and I will see you all next time.